Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest New Normal webinar. Today, the 51st, after our 50th last week. And today we are talking about blockchain, which is a subject that fascinates me incredibly. To those of you that are here for the first time, welcome, and hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn something, and I hope it feels like you want to come back. For those of you that have been here before, thanks very much for your support. And as always, there is a chat button on the screen somewhere. Click on that, and if you have a question or you have an opinion that you want to share, then please give a shout, and we will answer it. We'll be monitoring it during the discussion, and we will bring it up with our guest, Andrew. And with that, without any further ado, I shall hand over to my co-pilot to talk us through the agenda for this week. Shahid, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. New Normal webinar, episode 51. So New Normal, the background to New Normal for anybody who's joining for the first time is Steve and I challenged ourselves about a year ago when COVID first began that we really needed to up our game around knowledge acquisition and knowledge sharing, creating a community, if you like. And we thought that the webinar would be a great vehicle to be able to do that. And we've been very fortunate to have been joined with some very professional people helping us, supporting us in the background. And thank you to all of them. And also, we've been blessed with an audience like yourselves who keep coming back each week, share the good news of the webinar, and network and share it in social media as well. So thank you for that. The purpose of the webinar, as we've said, is we like to dive into subjects, try and learn something for ourselves which will help us in our social and our professional lives. But also we try to highlight interesting technologies and interesting people in our network who we'd love to have us and sit and have a chat. And as Steve so accurately described, it's like having a chat in the pub where you've got some friends around a table, discussing a subject. And if we can help you to walk away from today's subject, blockchain, with some knowledge or some insight, which you can then share and say, yeah, you'll never guess what I learned type conversation, then we consider that a measure of success as well. So thank you. Blockchain today is all about, well, the subject is all about blockchain, and we're delighted to have Andrew joining us. Andrew will be introducing himself shortly. He'll go through the subject. So many of you have heard about blockchain. Many of you heard about the promise of blockchain, how it's going to revolutionize every area of technology, certainly, and perhaps go into the wider world as we know it. Has the hype lived up to the reality? My estimation, probably not, but we're going to learn a little bit more about what it has done, what has been the journey for blockchain, what is the potential for blockchain in the future. Now, while we're going through the presentation, do take a look at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat icon. In that chat icon, please do, if you've got any questions, queries, observations, any challenges, Steve and I will be monitoring that throughout the webinar. We'll be happy to pick that up and share those as we go through with the panel. At the end of the webinar, we will go through the resource page. The resource page is our continuing commitment to you. It is every webinar topic. We create a documented resource sheet with white papers, with additional research in the web, with video links, etc., and some use cases for that particular subject which you can pick up and share and use as you please. At the end of the webinar, we will be indicating for you next week's topic as well. So hopefully that will encourage you to join, or perhaps share again in your network and community and encourage others. With that, if I may, I'll hand back over to Steve, and let's get through this interesting subject of blockchain. Thank you.
Cheers, Shahid. So I always get this slot where I'm here to set the context of the discussion, and I always like to use a slide. Today I'm hugging the limelight because I'm using two. But today I thought everybody that's been on before will know that I love my Gartner hype cycles, particularly for obviously for technology. And I looked at the one for blockchain and I thought I've got to share this one, because if we look at the various points of the hype cycle that Gartner used, so when it's brand new, it's in it's an innovative idea, it's an innovation. Then it reaches right up to the peak where everybody expects it's going to be absolutely earth-shattering and the world's going to be really grateful for it. Then it dips as everybody realizes that it doesn't quite hit that absolute hype. And then over a period of time, it becomes actually, we realize that there is a good purpose for this technology, and then it goes into everyday use. And we see those things. So I thought, I wonder where blockchain is on a hype cycle. And if we see them, we look at it, we see that blockchain's actually right in the trough of disillusionment, where Gartner think it's still probably 2 to 5 years before it's going to actually become every day, and we're all going to be really using it. I think we'll talk, and Andrew will talk about provenance and other use cases for it. And I think one of the new ones coming through is authenticated provenance, which I think was something that I read with quite interest, which is around, it's one thing to start with the details and start with this item and start building on it, but how do we know that what we start with is actually right and is actually totally valid and totally true? And I think that was a part that I read about and I found fascinating, which either says something about me or says something that it is actually an interesting topic. One point that Gartner did right in their report is, I've underlined on the screen, which is that they do expect leading software vendors to increasingly integrate blockchain technology as a feature in their enterprise software. So for all the folks around that's involved in the SAP, the Oracle, and those other worlds, think about it, because it is going to be coming through, and we can see that and expect that it'll end up moving and becoming something more pervasive. But it's already out there, because I then just did a brief look at some news headlines from the last year, and what we can see out there in the news that's actually being used. And even way back to last July, Information Week put had a story all about during this global unrest and during the whole pandemic, it'd be great if we can detect fakes, and how can we do that? And that'll be used using blockchain. We see the bits in the report, and we'll talk about it during this webinar about hospitals tracking vaccines, about tracking tests that Andrew talked about last year. Vaccination passports, very topical at the minute, could be used with blockchain. The IATA, which is the travel people, the International Airline Travel Association, are talking about doing that, and other elements. And even during the presidential election, I managed to bring several of our threads together, because we had fake news with Google last year, we got blockchain again, and how can it come together with and spot fake news and deep fakes using blockchain? So there's lots and lots of real cases out there, and I'm really looking forward to having our discussion with Andrew today to go into more detail. And I think what we'll do is we've got our standard 5 points, but we're going to start, and Andrew's going to do a very simple blockchain 101, no pressure. For those people that have heard about it but don't fully necessarily get it. We're going to talk about blockchain through the pandemic, a bit of provenance and sustainability. Deloitte, we've done a blockchain survey, so we will talk a bit about that. And then innovations and futures, and Andrew's doing lots of exciting stuff. So really looking forward to this discussion. So Andrew, welcome to the party. And do you want to give yourself a brief introduction?
Hey, thank you. It's nice to be here again, a year on. So I'm Andrew Darley. I led blockchain in Europe for IBM for 5 years, which in blockchain terms is from the dinosaurs, the ancient history of blockchain until the start of this year, at which point I decided to leave and become an independent consultant. And now I am working with a number of blockchain startups, of which there are a lot in the UK. The UK is a real innovation hub. I'm not sure if it's obvious to all of you, but in many areas, in pharma, in energy, in financial services, the UK is the #1 in the world innovation hub for this sort of stuff, right? And hopefully Brexit willing, it will stay there. And it's a really interesting time here in the UK. Now, let me give you a really simple overview of blockchain, right? It's not complicated. People try and make it sound complicated, but it's really simple in concept. It's a way of sharing data between multiple parties, between different companies or individuals, right? And that data, there is only one copy of it, right? Each individual participant doesn't have their own copy. There's one copy shared and replicated amongst everyone, all right? And you might think that's a bit dull, a bit boring, but let me tell you some of the attributes it has. So number one, there's a concept called consensus. So for the status of something to change, for example, a Bitcoin to be sold and bought by somebody else, multiple parties have to agree that that transaction has happened. So it has to be endorsed and consensus has to be reached by multiple parties, which gives it a real definitive proof that a thing has happened, right? Which is really, really cool. And secondly, there's a built into the architecture of the thing, there is a provenance of something from the beginning to the end of the life cycle of something. There is provenance built in. So everywhere something has changed hands. So for example, if you're selling something expensive like a handbag, you know, a designer Italian handbag from Milan, you know, and you're buying it from somebody in London, if it's been logged on the blockchain, you will be able to tell with 100% authenticity where it was made, who it was sold to next, who it was sold to after that, and so on, right? And you know it's a genuine product with 100% verifiability, right? So there's a provenance aspect, and that applies to food, for example. If you want to know where your food's come from, or you know, an expensive bicycle or something like this, right? It's got that attribute. And then a third thing is immutability, which is a big word, but what it means is if something is written to the blockchain, it can't be changed by anyone, right? So if, for example, I sell something to Steve, that's logged on the blockchain. And if I am a fraudster and I want to change that and say, actually, it wasn't sold to Steve, it was sold to me, I'll pop round his house and nick it. That cannot be done. There is no way to alter that on the blockchain, all right? It is there forever. So this immutability aspect is another thing. So you put all these things together, it's a single view of data with provenance, with immutability and consensus or endorsement. And that's a really powerful combo that you can do lots of things with, right? Let me just say there's two types of blockchain. Let me clear up this element first, right? So there's one sort which power virtual currencies, right? They're called non-permissioned blockchains, right? And you might think of Bitcoin or Ethereum, or the, you know, there's maybe 20 popular ones out there, right? And they have they differ from the other blockchains in that they are non-permissioned, i.e. you are anonymous. If you're buying and selling, you don't need to know who you're selling to or who you're buying from. And actually, rather more than that, it's intrinsic to the product, right? To the architecture. You are anonymous, right? And then there's another sort called permissioned blockchains where your identity is absolutely important and you can't do anything on the blockchain without verified identity. And that's the sort that we use for business, for provenance of goods, for energy trading, you know, anything that's regulated, all right? And there's a fundamental distinction between the two.
Right.
All built on blockchain.
Because I think everybody knows, I mean, you know, I think from the very first time I've spoke to you, Andrew, I've always gone, but everybody just talks about Bitcoin and Bitcoin's just everything. And that's a total tight link between the two. And it's what we can identify with. But you said something about Bitcoin when we were in the introduction, and this is one of my bits that it's the you'll never guess what I've learned today a bit, which was it was something about the energy used because of the way that the Bitcoin process works. So go on, I'll let you elaborate it again. It was brilliant.
Well, absolutely right. So Bitcoin is a currency. It might be virtual, but it's still a currency. And to give it credibility, that there has to be something backing it. If you were the Bank of England, right, the pounds that you have in your pocket, your pound notes, that they used to be backed by gold. It's backed by something, right? And for Bitcoin, it's backed by a thing called proof of work. So what that is computers solving really hard problems, and the first one to solve it is then able to write the next block onto the blockchain. Okay, and if you look at Bitcoin today, there's lots of stats about it. It's up to $50,000 and so on. It's grown 4x since this time last year. Lots of stats, but one of the amazing ones is the amount of energy used in Bitcoin today is more than the country of Sweden, the whole country, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, I've heard that as well.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is with Bitcoin and all of these other digital currencies, because they're not backed by or created by a central bank in any country, people need that, as you say, validation. They need that some kind of authentication to know that what they're buying or what they're getting into has some kind of provenance. It's got some kind of chain of ownership and creation. Yeah. So it's extremely important to them. If you think about it, digital currencies didn't exist a few years ago, but suddenly they've existed, and blockchain has come along at a convenient time as well, because it seems to coalesce very nicely with these new innovations.
Yeah. I think it's a really good thing for consumers, right? For us individuals to be able to have money which isn't controlled by a government or politicians, right? So open standard money, which can't be fiddled around with by politicians, I think is a very good thing for the future. I mean, there's problems to iron out, obviously, but I think in general, it's a very good thing. And if you look at what's coming around the corner on currencies, proof of work won't be there forever, right? So if you look at the second biggest virtual currency, that's Ethereum, they are going to be switching to proof of stake, which doesn't have this same massive compute requirements later this year, right? So there will be alternatives which will be better from a sustainability and save the planet viewpoint coming just around the corner.
That's that'd be good. Just as a quick temperature check, if anybody, just prove anybody's out there, if could add in the chat, did that explanation make it clear for you, and is everybody happy that they know what blockchain is before we start going? Just type a yes into the chat if that works, and if we get one response, I'll be really happy. But that would be really useful, because we're going to now move on and just look at things, because I didn't realize, and Andrew mentioned it in his last time about when he was talking about tests. I think it was COVID tests was the thing you mentioned the last time you were on, that it was starting. And it's been quite important throughout the pandemic with a lot of work that's gone on around it. Testing and distribution, I believe.
Yeah, and cases that you may not have heard on the news, it's been really important. So let me give you one example. BP have lots of oil rig workers, right? And they stay in a rig for maybe a month, then they come off, spend some time at home, and then they go back to a rig. And they have to have tests often and frequently, and they have to have real provenance of those tests to prove that they're okay to go back onto this really enclosed space for a month, right? And that's an ideal use for blockchain, right? Because there's two sides to it. Number one, you have to prove who you are. So there's a digital identity side, which blockchain is really good for. And then there's this immutably proving that you've had a blockchain test and what the result was, So it's companies like BP that have tended to, jump straight into this bandwagon. Politicians have been rather reticent to do this at the moment, because I'm sure you've seen in the news about the passports. There's a huge hoo-ha about whether this is infringing on personal liberties, making you have to have a passport. And the politicians right now don't want to make a decision one way or the other. They seem a bit scared of it.
Yeah, I think they don't want to be seen to be the one that actually does it, even though everybody really wants it.
Yeah.
I think Yeah, we'll all quite happily have an injection to go to the Maldives or something like that. But the concept that if we're told by the government, that's something different. But we'll avoid the politics, I think. I'll get myself in really hot water. But
it does work ever so well, though. I mean, the COVID test and the COVID provenance has been a huge success in lots of geographies around the world.
Yeah. So what have they exactly? What have they done? Is it just following the testing and the vaccines around for the distributions and stuff like that, and making sure?
Yeah. Well, as you know from the news from last year, right? Our test and trace system was initially built on Excel, right? Which is not very good for data security and making sure that data is correct, right? And the single biggest thing that blockchain can do for your COVID testing, and where they've used it, like in the Arab Emirates and a few other places, you have 100% agreed, endorsed view of your test result, right? So there's no messing about. They know who you are, they know what tests you've had and when, and the result is verified and immutable, right? And none of this shenanigans about they've lost it. Like you remember Priti Patel saying that they'd lost all kinds of data last year.
Was only the 370 odd million, some million, 100,000 tests, wasn't it?
Yeah, not too embarrassing. So with the blockchain, and there's one thing that we haven't really mentioned is it's distributed, right? So there isn't a central database somewhere that everyone has a view of. That's not how everybody has the same view of stuff. It's actually distributed, right? There are lots of copies, but only one view of the data. So it's a really smart architecture. You can't lose stuff. It's impossible.
Andrew, you've described a couple of good use cases and the fact that it's starting to pick up in terms of almost like a second nature plugin as part of the functionality in a technology roadmap for a lot of solutions. If I am a developer or the owner of an innovation, how do I go about, for instance, incorporating blockchain into my development roadmap? How do I plug it in?
Yeah. Well, the good thing is actually blockchain isn't so complicated, right? That there are really fairly simple ways to decide whether you need traditional IT or whether you need blockchain. And typically you just look at those attributes that I've talked about. Do I need a single view of the data? Do I need provenance with 100% verifiability and so on? And if you do, then you replace the database you are going to use, which, SQL or something, with a blockchain, all right? And actually, you probably go for a hybrid model. It is probably the best way forward, is that you keep some of the core data on the blockchain and some of the data off-chain in an object store somewhere, right? And it's actually really easy to do. It's really easy to add. It's not complicated tech at the heart of it.
Fascinating. I like the way that we can just ask those questions. And actually, when you ask those questions, you can instantly see things that just fall into it and all of that. Anything that you want to trace. Let's go back to horse meat and stuff like that. That was, well,
oh, yes.
All of that. If we've been
traceability, material traceability.
Yeah, it's all of that sort of stuff. And I think, it's certainly been one of it's been a huge success through the pandemic. And I know obviously at Deloitte, we've been involved in a lot of the testing, not the tracing, but the testing and some of the setting up and hearing what some of the guys has been up to. It's really interesting. But then we move into more of the everyday life, which we sort of just started touching on, which is the supply chains and things like that. And who's currently doing big stuff in some of the supply chains? Are we looking at stuff that traverses the world? Are we looking at things country by country? Or what are some of the big cases that's going on, Andrew? He says, putting him on the spot.
Yeah, no, I can tell you that. So surprisingly, retail, supermarkets are getting into this stuff. Not in the UK yet, because we're a bit distracted with other things at the moment. But certainly in France, Italy, Germany, Spain, the US, China, blockchain is now being used to track things. All right. And let's take France as the example, that they're our nearest neighbor. If you buy an organic chicken in a French supermarket, typically it's now tracked by blockchain, and there's a QR code on the front of the packet. You scan it, it tells you which farmer grew it, under what conditions, what the carbon footprint is, how many miles it's traveled, some recipe suggestions, all this sort of stuff. And that's one example of a big company using it. Let me give you another, which is very topical given the Suez Canal shenanigans and the Ever Given cock up. Is that the vast majority of ocean containers are now tracked on a blockchain. And you might think, why is that interesting or important? Is because previously it was all done on paper, bits of paper, literally. The ship's captain or officers would be carrying around about 200 pieces of paper, which might be a customs declaration, import forms, all kinds of really boring stuff, bills of lading, and it's all on paper. You wouldn't believe it, right? And it's been improved now, so it's all on blockchain. About 2/3 of the world's containers are tracked, and what it means is where your stuff is. And you can clear it through customs a bit quicker. You can do your trade finance a bit quicker, maritime insurance a bit cheaper. Everything's just a bit better. Okay. I'm just going to pause for 1 second while I let the dog out of the room, whining at the door.
It's interesting. And it's interesting what Andrew says on that one there, because I spent a year working with a rather well-known banana, I was going to say manufacturer, but actually it's a banana grower and distributor that may or may not begin with F. And it's interesting too, you mentioning all of the stuff around when we were dealing with collecting the bananas from the farm, putting them into the containers, linking the containers, therefore booking them on the ships, understanding which ship was going, understanding where they were in the actual loading on the ship, because there was preferences, and then actually taking some of the feeds on temperature for those containers as they're traveling around the world to understand whether that individual container had gone below or above the recommended temperature for that product, and therefore being whether it would be usable or whether it would have to be sold off or scrapped. Right the way to being able to take it off in the port, like you say, unload easier, customs declarations, and then move it on to ultimately to the supermarket that's going to buy it out of all of that. It was, and the idea now, because that was very paper-based, that whole process only 2 years ago. So I can imagine that now has got a huge opportunity.
It brings up an interesting question, Steve, which is, in the use of blockchain, Andrew, does it increase the administrative burden, or does it all happen automatically in the background?
Well, yes and no is a simple answer to that, right? I mean, blockchain isn't complicated, like we said. It's just a way of sharing data and having a single view of it between different parties, right? And that reduces overheads in some ways, but it also increases them in other areas, right? Because now there is a burden of endorsement or consensus. Two parties at least have to agree that something's happened, right? And typically this is automated in a blockchain by a thing called a smart contract, which is an automated workflow that is triggered if something happens, and it's triggered in multiple parties and they can agree. So it's kind of all automated, right, through this smart contract. But that endorsement didn't happen before. Previously, what happened was one company would assert, that this, let's say that this container on the sea has arrived in Hong Kong. I assert it's arrived in Hong Kong, but the customs authorities don't agree. They have to send somebody around with a clipboard and go and check it, right? So with the blockchain, that becomes automated and everyone agrees at the same time. But it does create new processes that need to be fulfilled. So the answer is yes and no, right? It automates a lot of stuff, but creates a few new processes too.
Now I can think back. I mean, like I say, if I'm going back, and my big example at the minute is bananas, so bear with me. It is just thinking of the different people that had an interest in that whole chain, excuse the pun, from the grower, which was then into their local cooperative, which was then into the shipping company, or it might have even been an intermediary between there with a road transport company that claimed they then filled the container that then drives the payment. And then you're working with assumed data in many ways all the way through, and quite a lot of trust and paper and faxes all the way through all of that, which makes it so much more interesting. And then you put IoT and some of these other clever devices on top of all of this to actually update some of that information that can take away some of the administrative burden. It starts to open your eyes to other potential solutions to problems that exist out there as well, that you can think, we could do lots of stuff.
Yeah, having data which is valid and understood in real time is the key to opening up lots of good analysis, either through AI or other things, right? Let me give you a non-obvious example of that, right? So right now, there's lots of renewable energy being generated in the UK and everywhere, right? So solar panels, little wind turbines, whatever, right? And most of these are plugged into the grid in some way. But up to now, the real-time data hasn't been very good, right? But if you do start to understand these new sources of energy, and Tesla home batteries will become a source really soon as they pick up, and actually cars plugged into charging points could be a source of energy too, right? You could pull energy out of there when you need it. If you have a real-time view of the whole sources and sinks of energy in the country, you can suddenly start to make much better decisions about, for example, turning off or turning down a gas-powered power station in real time as more renewables come in, as the sun comes out from behind a cloud, right? And we do it at the moment, but it's a bit clunky. But as we instrument it and get good data and integrate blockchains, we can do it much faster and save more energy and cut out the carbon, right? There's lots of possibilities, and you can take it further and start to create local energy grids. So instead of having a national grid that makes all the decisions, you can start to have local electricity supply where the sources and the demand for the electricity are matched in real time, taking demand off the national grid and creating little microgrids, right? So you can think of one for the City of London maybe, or one for a hospital, right? And these microgrids will stop the necessity for transmission over massive distances, or at least to some extent, right? Which is a great benefit, because we lose a lot of energy in the transmission. You lose maybe 10% in transmission. And you think how much energy we're creating, how much coal we're burning, how much gas we're burning. You can start to make that more modern and more interesting.
It's a great use case.
Yeah, it's interesting, eh?
Electricity is going to play a bigger and bigger role in the future, because transport's so big, so massive as a part of our, social and economic life. And it's inevitable that we will be transitioning over to these renewable sources of energy. One of the things I want to ask about is I'm learning a lot more about blockchain as we're having this conversation, Andrew. Could you describe to us what is something called a 51% attack on a blockchain?
Yeah. Right.
Here's an interesting pub fact for everyone.
Wow.
Well, it's a really good and topical question, right? So I heard this being discussed in a panel last week, right? So for virtual currencies, we're going back to Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? And Ethereum have said they're going to move to proof of stake rather than proof of work, which takes away the need to have these massive computer farms generating lots of heat and using lots of energy, right? But what it does mean is basically the majority of the network saying that they agree that a transaction is valid, right? That somebody's bought something and sold it to somebody else, right? And what that means is, if you could dominate the network, if you bought enough ether to be able to dominate the network, then you could start to endorse your own things without needing anybody else, right? With this proof of stake. It would take a lot, right? With the current price of Ether, I think it would take about $6 billion to get to a 51% position and therefore dominate the proof of stake. But you could imagine, for example, some national governments or some big drug gangs could have that sort of money. So it might be an issue. So there are some safeguards built in, right? And the safeguards are automatically looking for people buying the virtual currency for this purpose, for a 51% attack. And they can be cut out of the network very quickly and automatically if they start to do that, right? So it's a theoretical issue, but there are safeguards built in to prevent it, right?
Oh, that definitely wins the prize for question of the day, Shade.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, no, because this is the kind of stuff of science fiction, as far as I'm concerned. It's stuff that we never thought about before in previous lives, but new technology is moving at such a pace that it's inventing or creating new problems, new scenarios, new challenges. And this 51% attack idea is incredibly interesting, but it's also a reality in some respects that people have to think about with authentication networks or distributed networks like this, where validation and proof are based on the numbers involved. Obviously, the bigger the network gets, the harder it is going to be to achieve that 51%. But in these early nascent stages, there is a potential that people create some interesting scenarios.
Yeah, and I heard Mark Carney talk about this last week, right? So he's the ex-governor of the Bank of England.
Fascinating. All right. So somebody as auspicious and august as the ex-Bank of England.
Yeah, and his view is that central banks will bring out their own digital currencies like Bitcoin, right? And they'll be doing it very soon. And I know the Deutsche Bundesbank and Banque de France are looking at it very seriously at the moment, as we are in the UK. And at that point, there's a couple of interesting things that happen, right? So number one, it can be regulated much better, right? And at the moment, the central governments and banks don't like it because they can't tax it because they don't know who the money's going between, right? And it's not regulated properly. If the central banks start to do it, then it will be regulated, right? And they'll be able to tax it and do sensible things with it. But there's a second benefit, which is probably not as obvious, right? Which is that virtual currencies move a lot, right? So if you have some Bitcoin, it can move 5% in an evening, right? So it's very, very volatile. The central banks will put some assets behind their digital currency. They won't back it 100% with gold, for example, but there will be mechanisms by which it is backed to stop it moving so wildly, right? Which is probably a good thing, unless you're a kind of foreign exchange trader or you're gambling based on the currency, right? So that's another implication of the central banks getting involved.
And that then brings the regulation, whereas you said earlier it's quite good that there's no regulation in some of it, but in other areas we want the regulation because I guess that'll add to more mainstream adoption as well, won't it? Because that's that feeling of a bit more security that people will have around it.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? One minute you want to run away from governors and banks of England and everybody else because they monitor you, they control you, they label you, they check where funds are transferred, etc. And perhaps the black economy absolutely doesn't like that and wants that escape valve of digital currency. But on the other hand, the average Joe like us who's not interested in anything nefarious is looking for something which perhaps appreciates modestly over time and isn't linked to paper and is digitally tradable.
Yeah. And one other benefit of a digital currency like Bitcoin is you can trade it in any country, right? It's kind of hard to spend your pound sterling or your US dollars in other countries, right? But Bitcoin is universal.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that people like about digital currency.
Well, there were some early adopters for Bitcoin, wasn't there? And I'm thinking about the lamentable story, unfortunately, of a chap who accepted Bitcoin for a payment for, I think it was some goods or services, about 7 or 8 years ago, before Bitcoin blew up, and he had his authentication or his codes on a USB drive, which got dumped in the local rubbish tip or whatever. 8 years later, that drive is probably holding something like 200 or 300 million pounds worth of value. And he's gone to his local council and he's asking them, look, I'll give you a share of the 200 or 300 million. Please help me to dig through 8 years of household rubbish.
Yeah.
And this is an actual story in the UK, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's true, right? It's absolutely 100% true. He's only got himself to blame. If I had 200 million pounds worth of stuff, I would know where it is. It'd be in a safe somewhere.
Yeah, but that's the problem, though, Andrew. When he had it, it wasn't 200 million. He didn't know what the trajectory of Bitcoin would be over the years. Yeah. So, hindsight's a great thing, and this is perhaps he's become that cautionary tale for hindsight. Who knows?
Yeah, I bet he was one of those teenagers where you walk into the room and you're like treading on discarded clothes and socks hanging from the light fittings, and I bet he was one.
That's all of us, isn't it?
Every teenager, isn't it?
No, I mean, on a serious one, the thing is with something like blockchain, does it have the potential to actually add value to an idea?
Well, yes.
Can it help accelerate value in innovation?
Yeah, I'd actually frame it a different way, right? With blockchain, you are able to do things which you can't with traditional computing, okay? And what it means is you just need to look at things through a different lens. You need to think, what could I do if multiple parties, multiple companies all had one view of the same thing, right? Yeah. And there are lots of things you can do that you just can't do any other way, right? And we've talked about provenance. Provenance is a nice, obvious one, but let me give you a few other examples. And I think government is quite an interesting one. So voting, for example, right? You know from the US, right? The most advanced, wealthiest country in the world is struggling to prove that its votes cast are genuine, right? Or Joe Biden says it's all fine. Donald Trump says it's not all fine, but nobody can prove it one way or the other, right? It's really hard to get that positive assertion that everything has been done in the right way. If you use blockchain, if you use digital identity, so you had to use Face ID or some biometrics to prove who you were at the voting station, and as you voted, you could see something updated in real time saying Steve Ingram has voted. Doesn't tell you who you voted for, but there's suddenly a tick. You voted at this voting station. Tick. It's done, right? There can be no more arguments that you're also voting in somewhere else, in some other place, and somebody who's pretending to be you has voted, right? You could very quickly start to fix things like that, right? And there's lots of other things. We're limited by imagination because we're looking at it through a completely different lens now, where lots of different parties can share stuff. Yeah, we need the ideas, and then we can go and build solutions around it. And that's why there's so many blockchain startups, right? There's loads of brilliant ideas, and people are going to get venture capital and building prototypes,
Yeah, I think that's really true, because I think it's true of various of the stages that we go through within technology, and we're all sort of old enough to have seen several of them. That you think that at times the first wave of anything tends to be, let's try and do what we've currently done or what we've always done in the past, but we'll do it either slightly faster or we'll do it in a subtly different way, but we still think of doing what we've done. And it almost takes these generations to come through that then start thinking about doing things in challenging the status quo and thinking it actually, they're called disruptors, they're called whatever, but it's just talk about, let's get to the outcome in a different way to the way that we're currently thinking about it. rather than just do it faster. Let's think of how we can get that outcome even better. And we'll see that coming. Like you say, I bet a lot of these blockchain startups are youngish guys, clever people coming out.
Yeah, there are lots of people who write a thesis at university, right? Maybe study it for their dissertation, or maybe do a PhD based on it. Have a great idea, and then rather than what used to happen in our day, is that you get your degree and then you go and find a job in a non-related field. Is they've got a brilliant idea and they go and raise the capital themselves, start the company, get it, make it real. And I think that's the single biggest social change happening at the moment. It empowers smart, driven young people to be able to go and build something themselves, which is just brilliant. Love it. Yeah.
Well, we saw that with Jack the other week, who had his startup. He was a guest on here. Jack Corns came on with his startup where he developed robots that climb walls to do working at height. So it'll do painting, it'll do cleaning, it'll remove graffiti, but the technology they use, it even goes upside down on a ceiling and it'll cling to it, it'll hold it because of the technology used. It's fascinating. And several of these other startups that's out there, and it's interesting, and I think it's a good point I've put the Deloitte blockchain survey on here, because what that actually showed as they were going through, and a lot of it would be with big enterprises as well, is that 50% of those surveyed, and it was nearly 2,000 businesses surveyed, were saying, oh, it's definitely a priority in blockchain, but they all believe that their competitors and some of their partners are much more advanced than themselves. And less than 25% of them had actually got it in any form of production, yet out of the whole surveyed, more than 45%, nearly 50% of those that were doing something new and doing something different had actually got it in production. But the telling bit in the survey was, what they said was, it wasn't just a case of we're going to use technology for technology's sake. It's because it actually solves this particular problem that we were trying to do. And that's where the business has come from. Yeah.
And I actually think when you put the chart at the beginning about the trough of disillusionment that most technology goes through, I think with most of them, it's because you try and pigeonhole that technology for a use case which isn't relevant, right? Because you want to do something with blockchain, you pick a case because, the IT director's excited or the chief exec's told you to build something with blockchain, and you go and build something, but it isn't suitable, right? So like we said earlier, you need to check whether you need the immutability, the provenance, the endorsement. Do you need those things? And only if you need them, go and build a blockchain, right? And there are lots of cases where you do, and those are the ones that you talked about, where they've taken them to production,
No, that's exactly right. And you actually used that spot on, because people were saying, the outcome, and I've talked to people, I've gone to various CIOs and various people I talk to in the network, well, I've got to get a blockchain project off the ground. I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And it's like, is that not thinking about it the wrong way around? You've got a solution and you want to find a problem for it. Is it not? We should be, if you're really meant to be business focused as a CIO, should you not be seeing a business problem and then looking at what the appropriate solution is for it, rather than just but it's egos as well, because it's CEOs that want to talk to their mates and say, have you got your blockchain initiative going? I have.
Whose blockchain's bigger? Yeah. Can I ask Andrew, we've had a question from Michael, which is a fascinating question. I just want to, I don't know enough about the subject to resolve it in my own mind. So I'm hoping if you could shed some light on this. So Bitcoin, as I understand it, started from a white paper by an anonymous fictional character, so the legend says, Satoshi Nakamoto. Okay. Does that white paper, did that also evolve to the beginnings of blockchain, or is blockchain an independent creation with a much more solid foundation?
It really does go back to his white paper, yeah. And we don't know who he is. All we know is that he did write a white paper, which he published to try and help it get it off the ground, right? But he published it anonymously. We don't know whether that's his real name. It's probably a pseudonym. There's speculation that it's actually somebody from the Nordics who might be behind it. You know, so there's kind of two schools of thought. It might be somebody Japanese. It might be somebody from the Nordics. We're not really.
It's the Banksy
sure.
Yeah, the Banksy of the IT world. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Remains anonymous but hugely successul.
And by writing that first block, because every block in the Bitcoin has less Bitcoins in it, right? It's just one of the ways the architecture worked. He wrote the first block, which had the most blockchains in it, and the value of those right now is about $750 million just from writing the first block. You know, so that's kind of a nice place to be, right?
Certainly is.
So theoretically, does he have that block? Does he own that block?
Yeah. So for you,
now the reason why I'm asking is not because of the money, but that would then provide potentially the validation or the provenance of who wrote the paper.
Yeah, well, like your story of the guy throwing the flash drive into the skip, right, and losing his millions. All you need to prove your ownership of the Bitcoin is a thing called a private key, right, which you store somewhere, right? It's a long string of hex characters, right? And that's all you need. That's the only thing you need to show that you own these Bitcoins, right? In the future, that may change because there's cool new technologies coming along that should take away the necessity for private keys, right? But we don't have time to talk about that today. You know, multi-party computation and other really cool technologies are coming, which will stop you having this thing written down or on a flash drive and throwing it away, right?
You're teasing us now. You're tantalizing us for a future episode, I can tell.
But we do need to know some of these new innovations and some of the futures that you're working with at the minute. Because we've got 5 minutes to go, and I'm conscious that we need to understand some of the sexy new stuff as well.
So where are we heading, Andrew? What's the new innovations in blockchain and some of the new use cases?
All right, so a year ago, we talked about provenance in retail. We talked about the COVID vaccines, that sort of thing. Yeah. And I've touched on some of the new areas, but let me just reiterate and kind of reinforce them. So number one, energy and utilities is really big, right? So getting these renewable energy sources onto the grid in an intelligent way, that's going to be massive, right? And I work with a company called Urban Chain. And what they do is they supply energy direct from a generator to somebody who wants to buy it, right? And at the moment in the energy market, there's loads of intermediaries and third parties, right? Which means that about 2/3 of the cost you pay for energy goes to these mysterious people in the middle who don't really do a lot. If you do it on a blockchain, right, we do the things that we talked about. We can create microgrids and do green stuff, right? But you can also get energy a lot because you can buy it directly and cut out all these intermediaries, which is really cool. And that's happening in lots of areas in energy and utilities, right? So in Germany, there's a utility called Tenet, which is, I guess, the same as E.ON or something here. And they're already using blockchain in production to do this stuff, right? And it's going to roll out across Europe and the world pretty darn quickly. I think it's working really nicely. So that's one area. Another area is identity. And we touched on this a little bit by saying you can use biometrics like your face ID or your fingerprint to prove that it's you doing something, and therefore do it in a better way. And an example is the lost passport, right? Mm. So you're abroad, you've had a night out, you've lost your passport, but you want to go home, right? At the moment, what you do is you get on a website to the Foreign Office, you fill in a form, it's really laborious, it's painful, it costs quite a lot of money. And at the end of it, you get a pink piece of paper which says, me, Steve Ingram, I've lost my passport. This lets me get home. That's all the piece of pink paper does, right?
Yeah.
In the future, you could use digital identity and blockchain to get a virtual passport sent to your phone, right, to your smartphone. You can open it up with Face ID, and customs and passport control will let you through with it, right? So that sort of thing. So I think digital identity is a huge thing that's coming, that's going to open up lots and lots of different use cases, you know.
Brilliant. How outstanding. So I'm going to have to pull it to a bit of an end there, because it's fascinating. We could talk all day. So if anybody's got any further questions they want to stick into the chat, and Mike's mentioned one about he's heard a couple of coins called Amazon killers. Can't think any idea how a blockchain could be an Amazon killer. I'll throw that out if you've got any ideas while I'm flicking to any more questions.
I don't think anything's going to kill Amazon, right?
Yeah, I think like Mike said, it's
a great answer. Yeah,
he can't for the life of him think it, but
yeah. I think Amazon will start to accept virtual currency, as will Facebook, right? So Facebook, you've probably heard of Libra, which is a virtual currency which they want to get out there, and they want to be the bank of the world. You know, that's Facebook's intent, and I'm sure Amazon will have a similar intent, right? And that's one of the reasons that the central banks want to bring out CBDC before these tech startups, you know, well, not startups anymore, Facebook and Amazon, you know, start to really shake up the banking world, right? You know, so I think it's going to be an interesting time, but I don't think anything's going to kill Amazon.
Yeah, I think it'll be an addition. I've noticed there are more and more of these places that are listing Bitcoin as a payment option.
Yeah,
I don't know how many people would pay for their stuff online using Bitcoin, but
well, I've got a friend who's
you're just bragging now. Yeah, okay.
yeah, I'm boasting with the friend.
Yeah.
I've got a friend who's he's not working. He's, you know, trying to find a job out there, has been for a little while. He's struggling, but even he has a online digital account where he buys a fraction of digital currency every week. He puts in £10 or whatever he can save just to buy a fraction of a digital currency. Now that's how pervasive I think digital currencies and saving for the future, I guess, has become, just as an illustration.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, go on then. We'll let you do your bit.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Fascinating discussion, Andrew, so thank you. To further expand on the discussion, ladies and gentlemen, this is the resource page for blockchain. If you take a look at the top, you'll see our smiling faces and Andrew's bio. On the left, you'll see two important case studies which we've shared with you on the use of blockchain. So Home Depot and Albertsons. So where blockchain has found a practical usage inside the retail setting. So you've got solutions, you've got services which are now using blockchain. On the right-hand side, you'll see various columns: blockchain, the pandemic, sustainability. We've tried to give you links further elucidating how blockchain has been used in those subjects. And then at the bottom, you'll see some thought leadership from the likes of Deloitte, Ernst & Young, Forbes, etc., on blockchain and where they believe blockchain is heading to. So if you want to use the resource page for yourself, for sharing with colleagues, or for creating your own presentations, we'd be happy for you to do that. On the left-hand side, you'll also see the next webinar, Workplace of the Future. That's next week's webinar. So if you're interested, or if you think that one of your colleagues might be, please by all means register for next week or forward on the invitation to your network. We'd appreciate it. With that, I'd like to say my personal thanks to Andrew for a fascinating discussion and a walkthrough on blockchain again after a year. We appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to the next episode, because you've hinted that there's some interesting stuff going on, Andrew. So we'll hold you to that. So thank you very much from me, Andrew. Appreciate it. Handing over to Steve.
Yeah, thanks as always. Thanks very much, Andrew. That's been great. And you, when I got back in touch with you, I thought we're going to have another good session, and it's been proven. Lots of nice comments and good feedback coming, which is good. Thanks for your time, and if ever we can reciprocate, let us know. Thanks to the team. Thanks to everybody that's attended. Thanks to everybody that's listened on record. It's a fascinating subject that is going to just continue evolving. And dear knows what it'll be like in a year's time. At least hopefully we'll not have been in another lockdown. That would be the main thing. So thanks to the team for putting it together, for helping us, Joanna, Lucas, Claire and Martin. And thanks as always to my co-conspirator, Shahid Latif, for again helping pull all this together and have a great discussion. So with that, look forward to seeing you next week as we talk about the workplace of the future. And will we go back into offices? What will that look like? And what sort of world will it be if we go back into them? Should be fascinating too. So thanks very much and look forward to it. Have a great week and see you then. Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.